Hello everyone, my name's Tom Poland, and I've been a user of the Deltek Acumen Suite since 2010. Today, ClearPlan Consulting presents to you how to get started with Deltek Acumen Risk. We're going to introduce you to your day one with the software, whether or not you've used it before, and if you've not performed a schedule risk assessment using any tool, don't worry. I'm going to walk you through the basics in Acumen Risk and get you on your way to incorporating both threats and opportunities into your project forecasts. One hallmark of Acumen Risk is that it's simple to use. Risk tools lean on intense mathematical concepts. However, that doesn't mean that you need an advanced degree in statistics to use the software. Quite the opposite. Acumen assures using simple concepts that you can load risk and uncertainty into your forecasts without really breaking a sweat. Key things to look out for in today's demonstration are uncertainty assignment using very easy to understand color codes, identifying and assigning risks using common terminology, and then when it comes to reporting, everything is similarly easy to understand and can be readily communicated to a project team that may not be excited about a risk assessment, but they know that it's an important part of the process. By keeping things simple, you'll have more success engaging the team and leading the team through decisions that need to be made based on the risk outputs. Let's jump right into the tool and go over the basics of assigning uncertainty. I've opened the Acumen Risk software, and one of the first things you're going to want to do is to watch our Fuse video, where we talk about opening a project and setting everything up just the right way. I've done that. I've opened one of the sample files that ship with the software, and I've gone to the S3 Risk tab. And this is what you'll see. We're just getting started. If you don't see the whole project plan, don't worry. We're going to expand it in just a moment. I'm going to get this out of the way, and I'm going to use this plus sign down here to start expanding the WBS. And one thing that might jump out to you in this hierarchical grouping visually is the duration uncertainty sliders. And this is the first thing that we're going to focus on today is setting uncertainty. And let's expand one of the WBS areas. And I encourage you to do these steps as well and become familiar with how these sliders work. They're very important to the schedule risk assessment that we're doing today. Let's go to early design and let's move that WBS level slider to yellow. And you can see in the detailed activities underneath, they've moved out as well. I can move this over to red. I can move this individual one back down to yellow. And I can even set one of these down here to green. Now these settings are going to have to come from careful conversation with the engineers and the other people responsible for executing the work. I have the luxury today of just moving them as I choose to show you how the software works. In fact, multi-level hierarchies are in play as well. I can go to the project level and I can set what I call this risk temperature for the project. And you can see all these items down here flowed according to how I set the project, except the ones that I set manually earlier. The ones that I didn't set manually move in line and I can set them back to off. Let's just set the whole project to light red. And again, I can go to another area and I can make some individual settings as well. Now, what does this mean? Red, yellow, and green. We're used to things like 3-point estimates and other factors that go into risk. And we'll talk about some of the other factors in just a few moments, like the risk register. But focusing in on these sliders for just a minute, if we scroll over to the right, we can see that we're crafting 3-point estimates as we move the sliders. Let's take a look at this first one that says 15, 17, 19. Let's move that over to red. Now it says 17 minimum, 17 most likely, and a 26-day maximum duration. The colors are associated with mathematical factors, which you can change. However, I like using the color sliders with the team because it's a more human way to discuss uncertainty. Hey, from a forecast perspective, with what you know today, are you red, yellow, and green for your future work in this WBS? That's an easy way to ask the question. Here's a complicated way to ask the question. For all of your work, I would like you to assign a minimum, most likely, and maximum duration, taking every activity into individual account, and yes, just add 4 more durations in addition to the one that you already gave me for these activities. You might be greeted with 2 responses to that. You might get a deer in the headlights look, or you might get someone who says, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll do a plus 10%, minus 10% for the minimum and maximum or something like that. And neither one of those strategies really have the impact that having the discussion about, hey, you said you're red. Can you tell me why? If it's the general uncertainty in executing the work and maybe the general uncertainty of the estimate to begin with, that's a good candidate to use the sliders. If they say I'm red for a very specific reason, you might want to take note of that. You might use the slider, but that also might be a good candidate for the risk register, which we'll talk about in just a moment. One more thing. I do want to emphasize to you that you don't have to do this by WBS. You can go to Activity View, Grouping. You can group by a hierarchical field, or you can group by code field, or have no grouping at all. Let's go ahead and group by location. Maybe I have higher uncertainty in areas of the project that exist in different locations. Now, I did not lose the slider settings that I set on individual activities to this point. You can see I've already inherited light red in this area from the previous arrangements that we made. Offshore, that sounds risky. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. So what I can do is I can move the offshore slider over to red. And any work that has offshore in the location code field has now been set to red. Now you've got to be careful about doing too much grouping and regrouping. You might find yourself overriding some of the sliders that you set before. I can lock certain ones in if I want so that they don't get changed if I do any grouping and regrouping. I'll go ahead and group it back by WBS. And here I am back to the original view. However, some of the items that I locked in when I grouped by location are now locked in. One more thing before we go on to the next step. There is a risk advisor which can correlate your uncertainty settings to the schedule quality. This is my favorite. Historical performance of the project to date, or any metric or field that you may have calculated or set in your schedule. Let's ask for some slider advice based on schedule quality. And the premise here is that areas of the schedule that have negative float, missing logic, excessive use of constraints and leads and lags, they might not flow the same way in the forecast as they should, especially if predecessor work moves out. So I have a series of recommendations here now based on the risk advisor, and it's recommending a lot of red because there are substantial quality problems with this schedule. Probably should have spent more time doing a fuse analysis, and there's a lesson in that to assure you have a high quality schedule. And at your option, either by WBS or by the whole project, you can assign the individual suggestions to each activity and actually have Acumen take control of the sliders. You may choose or choose not to do that depending on your individual situation and the maturity of the project, but I do want to let you know that that is an option. You can see that by using the WBS or other groupings in the schedule, you can quickly assign uncertainty. Is it a shortcut? It sure is, but it's arguably going to be more accurate than trying to work with the team members to tediously assign 3-point uncertainty estimates to every task in the project. You have a WBS and custom fields for a reason. In the case of risk, it's highly likely that you'll find some common attribute between tasks that correlate to a shared uncertainty rating. You can even start with an overall uncertainty color at the project level and then make refinements at lower levels as the team increases their understanding of the scope and the associated uncertainty. Let's dive right back into Acumen Risk and talk about identifying and assigning risks on a risk register. Okay, we're back in and we're going to talk risk register now, also called discrete risks. Let's import a risk register that comes with the software. It's not one that you should use for your real projects. It's just one to show you the format and how things work in the software. I do want to emphasize that. Acumen won't identify your risks for you. It gives you the capability to identify your risks and map them into your schedule. All right, I've gone ahead and made the import. Now the risks on their own, they're good to track in here. They have a type, focus mostly on threats today. They have a name, that's always good, so you know what the risk is. It's important to concisely identify the threats to your project here and maybe some opportunities. You want to focus on the cause, potential cause of delay. For example, risk of delay post-transportation due to incomplete work. I'd be concerned if this just said risk of delay. Risk of customs delays, no, that's sort of an inevitability. So that's kind of the cause and effect. But always when you're identifying risks, focus on what might cause a delay, not that there is just a risk of delay. Now this says due to fab yard constraints. You might revise this risk to say fab yard constraints. That might simply be the threat. And then you'll dial in the probability and the likely schedule and cost impact if the risk does occur. And this is inherently a delay here by setting very high. Now, again, we're similar to using the colors. We're using words that you can change and configure if you'd like. And then also configurable impacts, which can be days, hours, or even a percentage of the remaining duration of the activity. Whichever way you want it there, you can do it. You can have up to a 9x9 probability and impact matrix. We've got a 5x5 going here, plus a negligible option for both. Now, risk identification is very important. You're not doing a schedule risk assessment truly if you're not identifying threats and maybe some opportunities. However, it doesn't stop there. You have to follow another important step in order for this risk register on the right to affect the forecast driven by this schedule on the left. Fortunately, it's very easy to do. It works much like the sliders with just a small difference. Let's click on early design. Now, instead of moving the slider, let's consider which discrete risks on the risk register are most likely to affect early design. Having the luxury of not having to communicate with the project team right now, I can just start mapping in some threats into that area. And I can go to an individual activity and add more, or even remove some of the ones that were mapped to the WBS as a whole. And just like earlier, I could group this by location or other fields and attributes and assign risks that way as well. I'll stick to the WBS right now. Let's go further down. Procurement. That sounds like it might be ripe for customs delays and some other issues that I'll just randomly assign here. So we get a good, healthy forecast delay when we start looking at the results. Construction, who knows all the things that will go wrong on construction? Hopefully not many. But again, just to show you how the tool works here, I'll map some in. Now, there are ways to pull up a panel here and see what you've mapped into the different areas. If you note, when I do click on procurement, for example, you can see the risks that I've mapped in. So it's tracking everything that you're doing, and you can review everything that you're doing. You don't have to keep track separately outside of the software. And also remember, this is an iterative exercise. You're not going to have all your risks mapped and identified the first time out. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many, a schedule and cost risk assessment are an iterative, ongoing exercise, not something that you do once at the beginning of the project, file it away, and think about it some later time. It should be an ongoing part of your forecast evaluation and update process, and Acumen Risk gives you the tool here to be able to do that on a startup basis, and then on an ongoing basis as the schedule and forecast get updated. One thing that's extremely important to remember when mapping threats into areas of the project that also have uncertainty is that both uncertainty and the threats will impact the risk-delayed forecast. What this means is that if you're mapping a risk to a WBS area and you've set the uncertainty slider to red on that WBS for the same reason, you're double dipping. Uncertainty is suited for general variability, whereas a risk register risk has a name and you'll know at some point whether the risk event happened or not. They're two different things, so use them wisely, but not at the same time for the same reason. Okay, it's that time. We're going to run the Monte Carlo simulation and analyze the results. Here's where we learn what all of those inputs are going to do to our risk-adjusted forecast. And depending on the inputs and the dynamics of the schedule itself, this could be a tough lesson in how risk can impact your forecast. All right, taking the uncertainty and the risks that we've applied, let's go ahead and run the risk analysis. It's running the Monte Carlo simulation right now. Default is 1,000 iterations. You can adjust that. And I'm afraid I have some bad news over in the right-hand panel. Gives us a nice histogram of all the different finish dates that came up during the simulated execution of the project, taking risk into account. In fact, here's a good time to remember to go up to the project level and click there because this chart drills down. You can click the results anywhere and see if any individual WBS or discipline is expected to finish on time. Today we'll focus just on the top level. So I've made sure that I've gone over and I've clicked up here at the project level. Now, looking at the chart, this is bad news. We're supposed to finish on January 31, 2013. This is an older project. The finish date hits for the project don't start coming up in the simulation for months and months later. And the 80% is over at October 29th. October 29th, 2013. You can see it graphically with the intersection, and you can see it down here in the table. Down here in the table as well. You can add more to this chart. If you click up here, you can see some different choices for risk exposure and contingency. You can set your own defaults as well for what will appear on the chart first time out. I've set P80, P90, P100. My best case, May 23rd. My worst case, way out in December 30th. And many organizations that we've worked with like to look at a P80 and P90 perspective. And in fact, an increasing reliance on P90 to be conservative about forecasts. Now, what does this mean, P80, P90? What this means for P80 is that 80% of the outcomes finished on October 29th and earlier. So if you want an 80% confidence in the date that you're reporting, you'll look at October 29th. If you want to make sure you encompass 90% of the simulated outcomes, November 11th. And if you want every outlier case to be considered where the program was just having a bad day, start to finish, your worst case is another month and a half further out here as well. The higher confidence level you want, from P80, P90, P100, the higher you want to go, the further out your date's going to be. I would not be reporting a P50 or a P25. The minimum you're going to hear from me is a P80 and more likely a P90. Management doesn't like it, it's time to go back and evaluate those risk and uncertainty factors and make sure that everyone had their best foot forward when you were making that risk assessment. But these numbers don't lie. The simulation is robust, and this project, if these factors are real, should be planning not to finish on the originally forecast date. That can be a tough pill to swallow, but it's the reality of the situation. Now, let's get fancier and go to the risk drivers. The histogram told me the what. Going to the right panel and going to the risk drivers is going to tell me why. Now there's a couple things that I can do on the configuration here right out of the gate. I can remove the legend because if I hover over these impact bars, it's going to show me the threats or risks that are interfering with this activity to drive this amount of delay on the project using my default that I've set of a P80 confidence level. So let's put this in a sentence. Initial long lead items is being impacted by non-work days when activities have been pushed over weekends. So that adds time. Thursday to Friday becomes, if pushed a day, becomes Friday to Monday and adds more time to execution. The uncertainty sliders here are adding 6 days. And this first individual risk 37, is adding 16 days. And then this one is 12 days. This one is 7 days, 2 days. Another smaller one there for a net of 60 days. The same with site clearance, first wave, bid reviews. They have progressively decreasing impacts because Acumen sorted from top to bottom. You can roll this up using this display level capability and just see at your higher level WBSs. If management asks, hey, what's our biggest issue on this project? Construction risk. 151 days of expected impact, followed by procurement risk. Let's start with construction mitigation. That would be an accurate, good practice to start at the top here, roll it up, and give them the bottom line. Now, there's something clever you can do with this chart. You can rotate it to an event-driven view, and this is actually my preference. Because when we think about risk mitigation, we tend to think risk by risk. If we have a risk of customs delays, how do we mitigate that? Maybe we can get all the material shipped domestically. And now if we make that change, any activity in the schedule that may have been subject to customs delays, it's now fixed. So I like to mitigate a risk at a time. Our biggest threat to this project is where we set those uncertainty sliders. And we did set a whole lot of light red and red, so I'm not surprised to see that up top. A lot would go into mitigating that because you've got to look at each slider decision, either at the roll-up or the detailed level. Consider why you set it the way that you did and what would need to happen to set it more towards yellow and green and have more confidence. Then risk 42, this risk of inability to hire craft. If you hover over the bar now, it shows you site clearance, which is the activity that this risk is really impacting the most. If you go down to risk 9, risk of delay due to fab yard constraints, it's affecting a series of activities. That's why you see more segments on the bars. Now, as we did before, if this is too many segments and your management doesn't have an appetite to look at all of these individual relationships, you can roll it up and you can give them the bottom line that, hey, risk 9 is primarily affecting construction, as is risk 42, as is risk 12, risk 7, risk 4, and then the other dominant color we see here in this roll-up view looks like procurement. And that makes sense. When we had this chart rotated the other way and we rolled up the display level, we saw construction and procurement as the first two WBSs impacted. So it's different ways of looking at the same data. You'll develop your own preference. This is mine to group them by risk, see the overall impact, and understand the breakout of why right now we're forecasting a 271-day delay at an 80% confidence level to get this project done. Well, the bad news for this project is that it's not expected to finish on time due to the risks identified. However, now we have the charts and materials to pursue mitigation in the right areas at the right time. We'll discuss mitigation in a future, more advanced video. For now, I want you to focus on those risk inputs and the reports that you can run to identify where the project is expected to feel the most pain due to risk and how much pain, where it's coming from. When you know those things, you know exactly where the problems are coming before they happen, and that's a good place to be. Thank you, everyone, and we'll bring you more tips on Acumen Fuse, Risk, and 360 very soon. In the meantime, here's some information on the screen about how you can contact us and learn more.